Every grant goes through each of three parts that I'm going to call them parts. The three parts, we'll just say it's a meet and greet as you're going through your research and cultivation, and then that ultimately leads to your grant award. In contrast or in comparison, a relationship can also go through three parts or stages. Introduction, how did you meet? How did you meet this particular person that you're interested in dating and courting, which is the second stage. And then the third stage would be ultimately marriage or sometimes divorce. So the marriage would be the actual grant award, and if you continue to stay married, then that's the relationship there. However, sometimes that grant award comes to an end, and that would be your divorce. And divorce is not always a bad thing. Sometimes your grant can come to an end for a variety of reasons. Not necessarily always bad. You can still get a divorce and still be friends. That does happen. And then sometimes people actually get remarried. Have a grant that may have ended, and then somehow they receive funding from somewhere else, and then they reinstated that particular grant. So, hey, life happens. But it is the compliance that can make or break, or I should say, be the reason or cause of a good relationship and continued success for a particular grant or it can result in a finding, which hopefully a counselor, program manager, that's your counselor. When you're married and you need to go to counseling, marriage counseling, your program manager should be like your marriage counselor. They're the person that you go to and kind of get that readily available help. Especially if it's a counselor that you're meeting with throughout your entire relationship. Like sometimes people start counseling even before they get married. So maybe when you're in that grant cultivation process, your program manager is a person who is kind of helping you, walking you through the proposal. Once you receive the grant award, they're also there to help to assist with questions and to kind of guide you and give you pointers on the reporting as well. So if you are in the beginning stages of a grant report, or it's a beginning of a fiscal year, because sometimes you have organizations that have had grants with a particular organization for many years, and they've had a successful relationship with that organization for many years. All of a sudden, you may get a new program manager or a new financial accountant in, and maybe they were doing something a little bit different before, but they shouldn't have been doing it that way. But the previous counselor didn't really tell the organization that they shouldn't have been doing it that way, and because they had the relationship, they just kind of let things slide. And so now you have the new person coming in, and they're getting dinged for it. And they're like, well, I looked at, they submitted this and everything went through the last time, so what's going on? And then they were like, you know what, I understand your concern, but it should not have happened that way. And that happens. I've had that happen to me before, actually. And you think, okay, you know what, thank you for pointing that out. I didn't think it was such a big deal since the organization let it go through. I thought that, as long as we're not going over our overall budget costs, and the organization was okay with it, that it wasn't a major issue. And it may not have been. Sometimes you just have program managers who are a little bit more anal than others, and that's fine. If you need for us to obey all the rules, like in the Bible, sometimes people, compromise a little bit, stretch it, and say, hey, we have and a new age understanding of the scriptures. So, old school versus new school, or Old Testament versus New Testament, whatever it may be. Sometimes you have individuals who want to follow the Bible to the T, and they're a little bit more stricter when it comes to certain sins. So it is what it is. And if you get, especially if it's a new saint or a new program manager, and they're like, this is the rules, you have to obey this, just like an auditor, which is the reason why you have auditors that kind of get rotated out, because after a while you get that relationship with that person that you'll kind of give them more chances because you've been around for a minute. So, but somebody new may catch something that the older person didn't catch because they so used to seeing it. And also like when you're a parent, from what I hear, I was a wife and a mom at an early age, so my children got disciplined. But you have some moms that have like a different set of kids. They had kids when they were younger, but then they got remarried and they had another set of kids when they were older. And the kids that they had when they were older are way more spoiled than the ones that they had when they were younger, because they didn't have the energy to discipline them. It's like, I've been through this before. I'm tired now. Just go ahead and keep jumping up and down on that couch, because if I have to get up and say anything about it, it's not about to happen today. First of all, my knees got to work right. So, by the time I get up, you're going to be ran away anyway. It is what it is. But yes, that program manager should be the one to say, when you first get that relationship, that grant award, the counseling process, or it's the beginning of a fiscal year. You may not be a new client, but it's a new fiscal year, and the reporting process has started, and you've been submitting reports and they've been approving it. If there was anything that was an issue in those beginning reports, the program manager or whoever's the one approving it should have said something. They should have reached out to say, hey, your budget says this, however, you've been reporting this way. I just want to point this out before we get to the end of the fiscal year to make sure that it's not an issue and you receive an audit finding, or something happens where you have to refund some of the funds because it turned out that you weren't reporting according to budget. It could have been a situation where, in my earlier example, where they were allowed to get away with it because you were going over the total budget line and you have been reporting this way for years, but now we have a new person in. It could have been that situation, or it could have just been that no one was really paying attention on the approval side. Because if you received a finding, or if you had an issue where you had to refund money toward the end of the fiscal year, somebody failed at the donor organization that you were reporting to. There's no way that you were reporting the same way all that fiscal year and didn't have to pay any money back, or there was no issues, and then all of a sudden toward the end of the fiscal year you had to repay money. There's those liaisons, as they call. I used to be a liaison at one of my organizations where it was a real estate investment company, and they received their cash payouts and so forth for their compliance. And if there was an issue, I would call them or point out that this is what the issue may be. When you have a program manager, they should be the ones to call to say, something doesn't look quite right with this. We might want to have a meeting and let you know that this is an issue, so that there is no issue towards the end of the year. Because another thing is also corporations that award grants, private foundations that award grants, government agencies that award grants, they want to give you that money. They have budgets also, especially if it's an organization that receives federal money. They get that money from a federal agency, or they may get that money from a state agency. And so they've been given money to give to you. And if you have to give money back because they didn't catch that you were reporting incorrectly, they would have to also give that money back to the agency that they got it from. And so it's actually in everyone's best interest to pay attention to make sure that the client is reporting correctly. And it's not always because they are incompetent. Sometimes it's really a communication error. It's really a lack of communication on both sides. There have been times that I've had a question in a reporting and I reached out to the donor agency and couldn't reach anybody. Or I asked several, I'm a question asker. I ask questions and I've asked questions for clarification and didn't get a reply or didn't get a response in time. And then it turned out later on that it may have been an issue, but I'm like, well, I asked because we've been doing it this way. And then I kind of got an inkling or a hint somewhere that might not have been the case. And so I'm thinking, okay, well, let me ask about this just to make sure. And I did ask and did not get a reply. And it turned out that some of those were issues. That's not fair to the agency. It's not fair to the agency to come back after the fact, especially if they've asked and then they have to pay that money back, or God forbid get a finding or an issue. But sometimes it does happen that way. I worked for a agency years ago, and they were like a real estate tax credit agency. And unfortunately, the controller, he contracted a brain tumor, and it took its toll quickly, actually, and he actually ended up dying. I'm not really a big funeral person, but I actually went to his funeral. I think the whole office, he had it during the week, which is rare. I think he was was he Catholic or something? Forgot what it was. But he had they had his services during the week while we were all in the office, and it was like downtown. So they allowed us to take a break and go. But yeah, I just mentioned that case because it was an issue where that organization had something going on with it that was fishy that none of us knew about. Thank goodness. At least nobody at my fellowship circle knew about it. Because the organization had to later close under that name, and then I think they reopened under a different name or something because of those compliance issues. But of course, unfortunately, he got sick and passed away, and the issues that they had, they blamed everything basically on that person because he was not there. To defend himself, of course, if you passed away, and when really it was probably a combination of things as to what happened with that. It wasn't just one person. It was probably a variety of lack of communications, and so it really is in everyone's best interest to keep the communication, even within an organization. You have various departments, you have program departments, you have accounting departments, but the ultimate goal is to serve the organization. Well, you can point fingers all day, but the ultimate person who will be on the news or in the newspapers or the executive director or COO or CFO that would be having to stand in front of the media microphone is not going to say program department or accounting department. They're going to name the organization. So the ultimate goal is to make sure that the organization is not reflected upon negatively. It's like a household. If you're married, no matter what may be going on between you and your spouse and your children, you want to make sure that your household is reflected and not reflected negatively. So those of us who are or were wives, we know what it's like to have some issues sometimes, but you may have to put on that smiley face when you leave out of the house. And you may have some things going on with your children or relatives, but we're going to work this out indoors. And that's what it's really about. Like when you have your close friends, they come to you. You are their BFF because they know they can go to you and they don't have to worry about you putting everything on Channel 7 News. Now first, so that we don't end up on Channel 7 News. And so if departments and employees and staff and clients and donors can all understand that it's really for everyone's best interest to work together, because if we have to pay this money back, they're going to have to pay that money back too. And if organizations have to keep paying money back to governmental entities like the feds or the state, that can impact the overall budget that is approved for that funding area. So if there's we're fighting all the time with trying to get stuff approved down in Washington, the arts and homelessness and housing and all of those areas. If the clients are constantly having to repay money, that means that their actual numbers of what they spent for that fiscal year is going to be lower than what they budgeted. The same thing for the donor agencies that gave them the funding and that gave them the award. Their actuals are going to be less than their budgets too, because they're going to have to pay that money back. So if over time it's reflecting that our actuals are lower than we budgeted, all because of this lack of communication, because or finger pointing or whatever it may be, that means that the government can say, well, you guys don't really need this money for the arts. You don't really need this money for housing. You don't really need this money for homelessness because you said that you needed this in your budget. You needed $25 million, but you actually only spent 20 or 15. You know why? It's because all those refunds add up. They all add up. And while we're being petty and finger pointing, it's adding up. And then you know who ultimately pays for that? The communities that we serve. The people who really need the food and the housing and the other services, they're the ones who ultimately pay, because there'll be less to give to them. While we're in our offices being petty or being negligent or incompetent, that's what happens. And so it really is in our best interest to do our legwork and to communicate and say, hey, you may have been doing it this way, and someone else may have allowed you to get away with it, but really it should reflect this way. Let's correct it and do this budget amendment and move forward. There was a time when I had an agency that submitted a budget amendment to another agency, and it didn't even get approved at all. So the organization ultimately lost money that year because they couldn't recoup those costs. Because, like I said, a budget is just like, this is what we said we was going to do. We said we was only going to have 2 kids, but now we have 6. And I need money for those other 4 kids. But if I can't go back and change my budget, that means that my actuals are going to only reflect. I can't get all of my benefits, tax breaks, and all of that for the other 4 because I can't go back and change my budget. And so it's looking like my household don't really need the money, but really it does. So it's in everyone's best interest to keep the communication going.